Hi everyone, it's Charlene from Worth Inc. Thank you so much for joining us. Today we're going to be going right into a session on emotional triggers. If you don't know what emotional triggers are, we're hoping that you'll be able to understand it by the end of this process. We have our guest speaker, Latoya Palmer, who has a master's in social work in the state of New York. She joined us to let us know about the emotional triggers and, of course, how to cope, how to manage, and implement them in our lives. One of the greatest challenges we have is that we have emotional triggers, every one of us, in all areas of our lives. And that includes at school, work, church, the bank, wherever we are, even in our very households, there are emotional triggers. So, how do we start to unearth topics that no one wants to talk about? Well, that was our goal. We started a conversation, and we want you to join us. So, listen in as we have our conversation on emotional triggers. Have a great day.
We see
God
here,
bless,
our
and
emotions are
stay
not
tuned.
just simply feelings, but they are sources of information if we take the time to explore and process them. All right, so processing could be initiated by asking ourselves simple questions like, why do I feel this way? Or when did I start feeling this way? All right, it's just the beginning stages of getting to know ourselves and being self aware. All right, so the next emotion we're going to look at is jealousy. Another core emotion familiar to most of us is jealousy, the feeling we get when we want what someone else has. We feel envious of others when we perceive that they are more fortunate than us in some way, that they are happier, wealthier, smarter, or more successful. Jealousy can give way to the insecurity and hurt our self-esteem because it makes us think that we aren't everything we want. It's important for us to pay close attention to whom we feel jealous of and why, because it speaks volumes about what it is we feel is missing from our lives. So again, the emotion is telling us something about ourselves. All right. It's not just simply a feeling or an emotion just sitting on a corner somewhere. It's really telling us something about ourselves if we process it and get to know why we are feeling this way. All right. All right. So example, you have someone might say, you have such a great family. I'm jealous. Or you are so pretty. I'm jealous. Or etc. What do you think such persons may feel are missing from their own lives or feel about themselves? All right. You could put that in the chat box. Like for example, I give one example. Obviously, if someone is looking at you and tell you that, you're pretty, I'm jealous, obviously their self-esteem might be a little low and they themselves don't think of themselves as beautiful or pretty. All right. So again, the jealousy there is telling you something about yourself. All right, let's look at another emotion, disgust. Similar to fear and anger, disgust is an emotion rooted in our evolution. We feel repulsed by things that we consider to be unclean or disease-ridden, like cockroaches, rats, waste, and rotten food. We also feel revolted by things that go against our most fundamental social norms, such as heinous crimes and certain sexual behaviors. A feeling of intense dislike and aversion. Disgust is an emotional response we feel towards something that is unhealthy for us. All right. All right. Let's also look at surprise. Surprise is something we feel when something unexpected happens to us or those around us. Shock and surprise can intensify whatever emotion we're feeling, like happiness, anger, and despair. Can be intensified if we're in a surprise state of emotion. All right. When we feel surprised, we become more curious and alert because it forces us to change our perspective and adapt to new situations. All right. Let's look at trust as well as an emotion. So finally, there's trust, which many would argue is not so much an emotion as choices. And while it's true that trust isn't an instinctive feeling as these other basic emotions, it's still a feeling because sometimes you just feel like you can trust someone, even if you don't really know them that well. Trust is an emotion built on our experiences, and it's meant to remind us of both the good and bad that other people have done unto us, so we can better protect ourselves against emotional pain. Oftentimes, trust and love go hand in hand. So love, when a loved one betrays us, they often lose not only our trust, but also our affection. All right. All right, let's start out by asking ourselves, what are your emotions telling you? So we're on the road to emotional self-discovery at this point. We're trying to get to know ourselves and become more emotionally intelligent and self-aware. All right. So what are your emotions telling you? All right. So in the end, the journey towards emotional self-discovery is something we should all take if we ever want to have a better understanding of who we are as people. So take the time to listen to what your emotions are trying to tell you. Work through all the things you're feeling. Emotional awareness will not only allow you better control over your moods, but also show you things about yourself that can help you live a more meaningful and emotionally fulfilling life. All right. So we looked at emotions and what emotions mean with regards to the topic of emotional triggers. So let's take a look at trigger, the meaning of it. All right.
Latoya,
Yes.
is it possible that before we talk about the trigger that we look at your last slide? You mentioned emotional discovery. I think one of the things that we find very difficult is that persons just feel their emotions. They actually don't know how to put meaning to it. So you have persons who are frustrated, persons who are angry, persons or even in love and don't understand how to discover what it means for them as a person. Is there anything that you can help us to be able to understand when we are experiencing those emotions, how to actually discover them within ourselves, how to find meaning, any questions that we can ask to help us?
Yes. These questions are going to be answered further down in the presentation.
All right.
You'll see. All right. But if anything, just note this section. So if there are questions specifically in this area, we can still ask them at the end. Okay. All right. But I'm definitely going to address ways that we could actually get to know what our emotions mean for ourselves personally. All right. All right, let's go. All right. So as I said before, we talked, as far as the topic emotional triggers, we discussed emotion, what does that mean, and went over some emotions and examples of what they might be telling us. So now let's look at the word trigger and just delve into that a little more, what it means. Okay. All right. An emotional trigger is any topic that makes us feel uncomfortable or throws us off balance. All right. These emotional triggers are telling us which aspects in our life we might feel frustrated or unsatisfied with. As mentioned above, it can vary in each person because we are all struggling with something different. All right. All right. What are emotional triggers? They are those superactive places inside you that become activated by someone else's behaviors or comments. Pay attention to the fact that they're triggered by someone else. All right. Pay close attention to that because that's something that we don't want. As if someone else is, if the person that's initiating our emotions is coming from outside and other persons, we want to get to a place where we're not allowing that. And we can manage our emotions in a way that other persons are not in control of our emotions and behaviors. Rather, we are. All right. So that's the goal here, is to help each and every one get to a place where we're the one controlling our emotions and behaviors and not someone else. All right. So just pay attention to that. So when triggered, you may either withdraw emotionally and simply feel hurt or angry, or respond in an aggressive way that you will probably regret later. Your reaction is so intense because you're defending against a painful feeling that has surfaced. All right. Key thing there, we want to be the ones in control of our emotions, as I mentioned before, and not others. Often there are persons who enjoy having the power or ability to trigger us, propelling us into a place of anger and low self-esteem. All right. In other words, there are persons who enjoy pushing our buttons. I know a lot of us have heard that before, and can relate to those words. So hopefully, after this presentation, we can start to feel empowered to start our journey towards getting to know ourselves and healthy ways to manage our emotions and heal so as to not be easily triggered or emotionally controlled by others. All right, very important. All right, so what are emotional triggers? Your emotional triggers are wounds that need to be healed. These beliefs are based on fears. They are not reality. You don't want to be frequently triggered. It is exhausting and painful, especially for highly sensitive and empathetic people. Like myself, like I said before, I'm an empath. All right. All right. Some general sources for emotional triggers are, just on a general basis, circumstances in life, our mood that day, that week, that month, and our relationship with others. It doesn't have to be an intimate relationship. It could be a relationship with your parents, relationship with your coworkers, your friends, your children, just any relationships. All right. These are sources of triggers. All right. Let's look at some common emotional triggers, just examples. All right. Someone rejecting you, someone leaving you, or the threat that they will. Helplessness over painful situations, someone discounting or ignoring you, someone being unavailable to you, someone giving you a disapproving look, or someone blaming or shaming you. All right. So these are common sources for emotional triggers. All right. Additionally, just some other common sources for emotional triggers are someone being judgmental or critical of you, someone being too busy to make time for you, someone not appearing to be happy to see you, someone coming on to you sexually in a needy way, someone trying to control you, someone being needy or trying to smother you. All right. So who has emotional triggers? We might wonder, right? Maybe think it's someone over there, someone else. No, we all have emotional triggers, every last one of us. It can be challenging to identify what exactly those triggers are. As Sister Charlene was just mentioning just now, identifying the triggers it can be difficult. But the process of getting to know and understand them can help us heal. Keyword there, process. Well, I'll talk more about process later as well. So again, but the process of getting to know and understand them can help us heal and learn how to cope better in response. So the goal here is to heal and learn healthy coping mechanisms. All right. Okay. So as I mentioned before, we all have emotional triggers. The question is why? Why do we all have emotional triggers? All right, simply because we were all children once. When we were growing up, we inevitably experienced pain or suffering that we could not acknowledge and or deal with sufficiently at the time. So as adults, we typically become triggered by experiences that are reminiscent of these old painful feelings. All right. In other words, they bring those painful feelings from childhood back to the surface, back to our memory, and it triggers those feelings in our adult lives, oftentimes unconsciously. All right. All right, so as a result, we typically turn to habitual or addictive ways of trying to manage the painful feelings. And those are the maladaptive ways that we don't want to perpetuate or keep going. We want to unlearn those maladaptive ways or negative ways of managing or coping with our emotions. All right. Okay. Identifying emotional triggers. All right. So on a personal levels, what are your emotional triggers? Are there any that comes to mind? Don't be afraid to use the chat box as we go along. Have conversation as we go along. All right. So what do you do to manage the painful feelings that are triggered? Do you face your triggers head on or attempt to avoid the pain? All right. Here are a couple of examples that might help you to discover your own triggers. All right. Here you go, Sister Charlene. Example. For instance, if a coworker says you are not smart enough to apply for that great job, or a relative says you're too old to find a mate, you become triggered. You get upset, doubt yourself, and feel inferior, or even wrongly think that you're over the hill, as some would say. There is no hill to be over. On the other hand, if you thought, that's ridiculous, of course I'm qualified for the job, or no matter my age, I can find a wonderful mate, obviously you're not in a triggered state because you recognize your true worth. And obviously not everyone recognizes their true worth, which can leave us vulnerable and susceptible to being easily triggered. All right. Go Worth Inc. helping us to learn our worth. All right. All right. So the next example is Maddie. Maddie was raised by absent parents. Her father traveled frequently and her mother was emotionally unavailable. She was left alone a lot even as a toddler. And when her sister was born 2 years later, Maddie was put in charge of her by age 5. Maddie was not only in charge of making meals for herself, but also her sister and their younger brother. She essentially raised herself. Okay. So today, Maddie is a very competent physician, but she gets painfully triggered when someone she cares about isn't available. Do you see how this is playing out in her adult life? When she calls her daughter at college and her daughter doesn't return the call, Maddie gets upset and sometimes even begins to blame her husband for her pain, even though it has absolutely nothing to do with him. All right, so keep in mind that your educational status or how successful you might be does not necessarily make you less susceptible to being easily triggered emotionally. We also see here that Maddie could easily have been creating additional and unnecessary problems within her marriage simply because she was not aware of herself emotionally and did not heal from issues or emotional pain from her childhood. All right, so that's just an example of how issues or problems or emotional pain in our childhood resurfaces unconsciously in our adult lives and then snowballs into further problems, marital issues. In this situation, our husband had nothing to do with the situation. He was being blamed. All right. Okay, so until Maddie began her work with her therapist, she didn't realize that unavailability is her trigger. All right, and that she most often tries to avoid her old pain by blaming her husband. But now that she's aware of the trauma from her childhood neglect, Maddie is learning to compassionately attend to her inner child in order to heal. All right.
So, Latoya, how do we differentiate between what we would consider to be cultural responsibility? I mean, I believe a lot of us who are on the line have grown up in the Caribbean or have Caribbean heritage. And as Caribbean families, we tend to do exactly what you mentioned about Maddie, where our older siblings address the younger siblings or vice versa. And it becomes that you are a child, but you are also helping to parent your sibling along the way, because our parents, and especially when we migrate, especially when you migrate, your parents are sometimes working multiple jobs. And so it does come into our lives, not purposefully, but like you're mentioning, it may actually affect us later on, only because of the responsibility that's there. So I think I'm still getting to the point that some of these things we don't even realize has happened because our circumstances were just what they were, especially when you're from immigrant families in a new country. You don't have persons to depend on. You have to depend on yourself. So I think it leads to persons who grow up as adults who are emotionally unstable, who don't know how to deal with their emotions, and it becomes just this generation trigger, one after the other, one after the other. And it's difficult to deal with, especially when you think about the fact that some persons own their own business and they can't be there, all the time for their children. So I hope that as we go on, Sister Latoya, you'll be able to give us some more pieces, because this is something that I believe we all experience, not because we want to, but because it's part of our process being immigrants in a new country.
Okay. All right. So based on your comment, I would say the key, I'm going to give some more examples of how we can address these situations, but a lot of it is, it comes back to getting to know ourselves and why we react in certain ways, and being self-aware. At times, we can't see it in ourselves or acknowledge it in ourselves. Someone else might point it out, and it's for us to acknowledge it and put in the work to healing, because it's a process and it takes time. I believe I mentioned before that it's longer for some than others, because what tends to happen is we get trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma. So then it becomes, you have a lot of issues to work on, and you can't all work on them all at the same time. You kind of have to, I indicate later on, you kind of have to pick one and work on it, and then keep working on them until you heal. Again, it's really a process and it takes time, and we usually need help to process why we behave the way they do, why we respond the way we respond. So it comes back to us getting to know ourselves, and then working through the emotions and the feelings and our behaviors, and then trying to replace the maladaptive behaviors with new and healthier ways of behaving. And the new and healthier ways we might not be aware of because our parents did not teach us them. So we might have to go to a professional to get some assistance with that part. Some persons might join a support group, other avenues as such, to learn new ways to cope and heal from past hurt, trauma, and pain. All right.
Latoya, we have a question in the chat box that says, what is your suggestion for an individual whose childhood was great, but as an adult they were hurt, and they were hurt specifically in the church?
Okay. My suggestion for someone who got hurt as an adult in the church, I would say communication is key. I would go to someone, a leadership person who is trusted, a trusted person with regards to the church. I must say, speak specifically to the church. Go to someone in leadership that we can trust to talk to about it, communicate about it. We don't want to leave it, the pain or the hurt just sitting there. We have to communicate and talk about it. And a key thing to communication is, for our leaders that might be listening, is to try to understand where the person is coming from. we don't necessarily have to agree, but more so understand their pain and their feelings and acknowledge it, and then work through it. And if we can possibly involve the person who caused the hurt, that would be nice as well, because moving forward, we can prevent others from getting hurt, because we have to exist together moving forward, rather than avoiding the situation or walking away from the situation. In this case, leaving the church. It's important that we can sit down together as adults and communicate effectively and be empathetic and listen to understand. That's key. All right. I don't know if that was helpful at all. Okay.
So the response was yes, it that was helpful to that, and we do have somebody who mentioned that that it's a good point. Our leader have to have open communication, and I would add to that. I really do believe that persons who are in leadership positions should at the least have some level of counseling, or we should provide some basic counseling training, because when you're dealing with persons who are in the church who have hurt, in their past, or even from the present circumstance. You mentioned earlier people. He said everyone. He said someone is our trigger. If that's happening in the church, then yeah, we need to be able to support persons in a healthy way from an emotional point of view as well. So some training has to be there. So we're glad that persons like Latoya are professionally trained, because we do need that skill in the church.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, Sister Charlene. All right. So let's look at another example. All right. On how we can identify emotional triggers. All right. So this person was saying, my trigger used to be, not me personally, but this example, this person was saying, my trigger used to be anyone's anger or disapproval. My mother was a rageaholic, she says, and both my parents were highly critical. For many years, when someone got angry at me or disapproved of me, I will do anything to avoid feeling the loneliness and pain of their unloving behavior towards me. I felt lonely and helpless a lot as a child. So feeling any degree of loneliness and or helpless as an adult was a huge trigger for me. By learning to be very kind to my anxious inner child, I eventually healed this trigger. All right. All right. So to heal emotional triggers, we have to begin to compassionately examine and shift any beliefs that any of us have carried around from our family or society on a whole. Just an example, especially as, say, for example, racial issues. Certain minorities might feel a certain way because of how society portrays them in, for example, movies, or just in commercials on TV, things that we're seeing every day, and it feeds our mind. The fact that even something as big as society can have such an emotional impact on us, we have to be aware of that as well, what we're taking into our systems. All right. So again, let me just read this over. To heal emotional triggers, we have to begin to compassionately examine and shift any beliefs that we've carried around from our family or society, such as I am not smart enough, or I'm too sensitive. You need to gently address the parts of yourself that feel flawed or have self-doubts about your body image or your worthiness to find a partner. Those are just some examples. When you heal the initial trauma or false belief, you set yourself emotionally free. Then you won't become as easily triggered or drained. All right. So I'm going to just go over 5 strategies to start healing your emotional triggers. The first one is to be aware. Self-awareness is very important, because if we don't know it's there, we can't really work on it, right? So be aware. Use an example of a way is to use a journal. In your journal, you want to identify your top 3 emotional triggers, which cause you to be most upset and thrown off balance. For instance, when someone criticizes your weight or appearance, or if you don't earn a certain income, or perhaps you feel unlovable and undeserving of a healthy relationship, write these down to clarify the aspect of yourself that needs to be healed. All right. So basically, as I said before, a lot of us are walking around or moving around, maneuvering through this world, and we have numerous emotional triggers, but we can't heal all of them at once. We just have to identify some of them at least to start, and start working from there. All right. And utilizing a journal is a great way to start. Just one strategy. All right. Another strategy is to track the trigger's origin. Journal about where these triggers originated. For example, did your parents say that you were too fat or unattractive? Did a teacher tell you that you didn't have what it takes to succeed in school? Or were you neglected by your family? So you grew up feeling unlovable. Knowing where your triggers come from allows you to know yourself better. All right. So we want to look at where these triggers originated. Where could this started? And as mentioned prior, a lot of times it's within childhood. Not always, but a lot of times it's with childhood. All right. Another strategy for starting healing with emotional triggers is to reprogram negative feelings or beliefs. Start with one trigger that has the least emotional charge and begin to compassionately reprogram it. Tell yourself that it's not really reality. You have to tell yourself that. What's actually true is I'm lovable, capable, and smart. Basically, you're replacing the thoughts with new thoughts. As I mentioned before, you replace your maladaptive or negative ways of coping with positive ways of coping or healthier ways of coping. In this instance, you're replacing negative thoughts with good thoughts. All right. And you have to practice it. You have to verbalize it. You have to do it. You have to say it. All right. So basically, you're substituting the negative beliefs with a positive or more realistic one, rather than what someone else may have planted in your mind previously, whether it be a time in adulthood or in your childhood or in a relationship, because at times our partners may say something that makes us feel less than about ourselves, and then our self-esteem lowers as a result, all right, or takes a hit as a result. Okay. So the fourth strategy is act as if. At the start of the healing process, you might need to act as if. When you haven't fully integrated a new positive belief, that's okay. For instance, simply saying to someone, I disagree. I fully deserve this this great job. Even when you don't fully believe that, verbalizing it is helpful. All right. It paves the way for a deeper belief later on. Or another example, I am proud of my sensitivities. Please do not put them down. Sometimes you need to practice a more enlightened behavior for it to sink in and become reality. So basically what this is trying to say is practice becomes perfect. All right. So you're going to have to practice it. It's not going to happen overnight. You have to keep telling yourself these things. You have to keep practicing replacing these behaviors. Make it become routine, make it become a part of you. So eventually you change your thoughts about yourself, you change the way you react. We have to put them into practice in order for them to just become a part of who we are. In other words, naturally occurring. All right. Okay, so last but not least, another option is to work with a therapist or a coach. It's often useful to seek guidance to help you find the root of the trigger and process the feelings involved. You may feel tremendous rage or sadness that your family never believed you, so you never learned to believe in yourself. Expressing and releasing the feelings allows you to heal the trigger and move on to embrace your true power. All right. What tends to happen a lot of times, we are so caught up in the feeling and the anger that we don't get the chance to process why we feel that way and then heal from it. All right. So that's basically what this is saying. But with help from a therapist who can actually help you to walk through the feelings, identify the origins, you can start your journey to healing your emotional triggers. All right. So once you know your triggers, the first step towards healing is considering their origins. Not all triggers are from childhood, as mentioned before. Some can be from past intimate relationships, friendships, family members, work relationships, as mentioned before, even society, as I said. Nevertheless, we will take a closer look at childhood experiences, for example, later on in the presentation. You will get to reflect on which of your triggers might relate to childhood experiences. And importantly, only you can heal your triggers. I believe I got a question earlier with regards to ways that we can identify where our triggers are coming from or why we have them. The key here is only us, only you can heal your triggers. So take a little time to go inside and make sure to be patient and kind and compassionate with yourself. Because as I said before, it does not happen overnight. All right. And a lot of
Latoya,
yes.
Just before you go on any further, I just want to address two questions that came in while you were speaking. When you were on number 3, reprogramming negative beliefs, the question was asked about what about comparing yourself with others?
I'm sorry.
So reprogramming negative beliefs.
Right.
The question that was asked at the time is what about comparing yourself with others? So are you able to just speak to that on number 3, reprogramming your negative beliefs?
What about your comparing yourselves with others as it relates to negative beliefs about yourself? Did I get that right?
Yes, based on the question, that's what I understand is coming through.
Okay. All right. So comparing yourself to others. All right. All right. So I would encourage anyone not to compare themselves to others. Your biggest competition, if I can encourage anyone, is yourself. If you're gonna compare yourself to anyone, you wanna compare yourself to yourself. All right. So say for example, you were a certain way yesterday or last month or last year. You wanna always work on trying to become a better version of yourself. You want to evolve in the best version of yourself. You don't never want to compare yourself to other people. If you find yourself comparing yourself to other people, you want to look at what you're comparing. What you're comparing usually is saying something about what you feel like you are missing. And then that's something that you want to maybe look inside yourself about and work on. All right, for example, let me see if I could give an example that could bring that out clearer. As I mentioned earlier, say for example, you're comparing yourself as far as beauty. Wow, she's beautiful. She's prettier than me. That might go back to the fact that you have low self-esteem. And then there we identify something that you might need to want to go work on, so you can feel better about yourself, so you can feel empowered, so you can see the beauty in yourself, even in your imperfections. You might see the beauty in that. So again, comparing yourself to others is telling you something, but you want to pay attention to what you're comparing yourself with that person about. So then it identifies within yourself what you feel is lacking within yourself. I don't know if that helps.
Yes, I agree that that would help, and we do have some comments in the chat as well that basically corroborates what you were saying, Latoya. That comparing yourself with others does lack of self-awareness and self-esteem, and that's where you want to be working with. And one thing that I know in business it works. I'm not sure if it also helps here, but it's something called vision casting. Who do you see yourself to be in the future? What's the better version of yourself?
Right.
And when you know what you want to become, then you don't have to compare yourself to others. And we have to accept who we are as people. Accept your big lips. Accept your big earlobes. Whatever it may be. You have to learn to accept and appreciate who you are. We talk about worth, right? Knowing your worth, and that there's no one as good as you when it comes to valuing yourself as well. So thank you for addressing that as well.
Definitely. Everyone's unique in their own way and special in their own way. All right. It's funny because there's no one else. Even if we have a twin that looks like us, a lot of times we are unique despite even having a twin in our own way. There's no one else like us, a complete replica of us in the world. Every one of us is unique in our own way. And that's totally okay. And we should cherish and applaud that. All right.
Sister Latoya, I'm sorry, the questions are coming in, and I'm not even sure if you're going to get through your presentation, to be quite honest with you. I know that we're opening up someone says a can of worms when we start to begin to address certain things like this, especially when we're linked to the church and trying to address emotional triggers in the church. And someone has asked, how do we remove the stigma within the church about going to a therapist, about speaking to a specialist? Because, and I agree with the question, because there is a stigma in the church that if you go to a therapist, why didn't you go to your pastor? Kind of an idea. And we do need to be able to move past this. So the question's asking, how do we do that? Because you're a social worker. Some person may consider to be a counselor or a therapist. I know we have Evangelist Johnson on the line. She's a counselor as well. How do we remove that stigma to say you're going to a shrink in the church and not going to your pastor? Any thoughts on that, Latoya?
All right. So I definitely have thoughts on that. Okay. So again, it comes back to communication, right? If you feel like, all right. So on a whole, I'm gonna just look at the question as far as how do we get rid of the stereotype of going to a counselor rather than your pastor. All right, so we might have some pastors that are professionally trained, but we also have pastors who are not professionally trained, who don't possess certain tools to that they can share with their congregants with regards to healing certain issues and situations. And to be honest with you, if you would do more harm than good to try to help someone when you yourself don't have the tools to do so. So
I'm sorry, can you please repeat that again?
I feel like
I'm pulling your leg, but I really do want you to. I want you to repeat it again, because that is it affects ministry. It affects the lives of our loved ones so much because of that exact same statement. So can you please repeat that one more time?
all right. So a lot of our pastors are great, our bishops are great spiritual leaders, evangelists, etc. However, I feel like in order to eradicate this notion that going to a professional therapist is a bad thing, we need to encourage and encourage our leaders to be aware that trying to help persons when you yourself do not possess the tools or the knowledge to do so can create more harm than good. And it's okay to acknowledge that, listen, I don't have the tools to give you to work on this. So I would encourage you to really talk to a professional about it, and that's totally fine. So if I would tell you anything, I would say in an educational session to get the word out there so people can be educated on this topic, as far as knowing that the church, yes, we might have some pastors or leaders who are professionally trained, but not all are. So it's good to point persons in the right direction if they need professional help, to go get professional help, rather than try to help a situation when you don't have the skill set to do so or the tools to do so. As I said before, you would cause more harm than good.
Thank you, and we've had some persons in the chat are also agreeing with you, Latoya, in terms of seeking out counselors and psychologists and so forth. And it has been stated in the chat, and we'll reiterate it for those who aren't looking in the chat as we go along. There are Christian counselors. There are certified Christian counselors. There are websites you can actually go to. You can ask for a Christian counselor of your faith and denomination as well too. So know that there are counselors out there. And I believe also the other side is that as brethren, if you are aware that someone's going through counseling, you also need to recognize that's a personal growth experience. And we ought to be conscious to not shame or to question why they're doing that. As Latoya is talking to us tonight about, valuing yourself and working on yourself, we also need to support each other if we are aware that someone's going through something, and not shame them. We need to remove the stigma, and we are a part of the solution, not just the leaders as well.
Yes. Thank you, Charlene. As I had mentioned before, we all need to be aware that it's not some people that have emotional triggers. It's all, right? So all of us can benefit from working with somebody and processing whatever emotional triggers we may have. So again, it's all of us that have emotional triggers, not some, all. So again, there goes the stigma. We don't need to stigmatize it or look at somebody else's, because we all have our own issues, pains, situations that we're going through at any given time. All right. It's a good thing to talk to someone and process your emotions and heal and work towards becoming a better version of yourself. There's always room to grow. All right, so we're gonna continue. Let me know if I run out of time, Charlene, okay? All right, so I'm sorry?
No, I was just saying we have about 10 more minutes.
Okay, all right. All right, so how do you heal from emotional triggers? We're just gonna continue. As we mentioned with Maddie's situation, it's typical to avoid our triggers when we are unaware of them. So quick question, do any of these avoidance techniques relate to you? I get angry, I get needy, I comply. So basically, rather than addressing the situation or addressing the person, we just comply, just so we can avoid whatever that comes with it, the pain, the rejection, whatever comes with it, we comply. All right. I become a people pleaser. I shut down and withdraw from the other person. I blame someone else for my pain. I turn to an addiction, which we see a lot. Food addiction, drugs, alcohol, sex, porn, shopping, work, gambling, and so on and on and on. We can pretty much make anything an addiction. All right. And these are just unhealthy ways of coping with pain. All right. Okay. So how to heal from emotional triggers. It continues. So let me make this bigger because it's hard to see. All right, there we go. The previously mentioned triggers are examples of maladaptive ways to cope or addressing emotional triggers. Maladaptive definition. All right, I keep using that word. I just wanted to make sure everyone's aware of what it means. So, maladaptive definition: behaviors or responses that are not providing adequate or appropriate adjustment to the environment or situations. All right, so we all have issues in our environment, situations, and we adapt and as best we can. And sometimes we use maladaptive ways to do so. All right, through these behaviors might be maladaptive, though these behaviors might be maladaptive, if the goal is to heal, these behaviors cannot simply be ignored, but rather we need to identify, acknowledge, and accept that they are there. Once identified, we can then begin to do the work necessary to address and change these behaviors, with the goal in mind to learn, adapt new and more healthier ways to cope, manage, and heal from emotional triggers. If you do relate to any of these responses, how do you feel about them? All right. You can address that in the chat box if you'd like. You'll probably realize that the pain doesn't go away, right? Just because you try to avoid it. And you may even end up in more pain. I think it is important to add here that sometimes avoiding the pain is not deliberate or a conscious decision. This is why it is important to get to know ourselves and become self-aware. Example, many persons bury their pain and bury it so deep in their unconscious that they sometimes forget that the certain incidents or situations took place. One client once told me personally that he placed his trauma in a box, right? He refused to talk to anyone about it or even his therapist because she would make him open the box, and he didn't want to have to cry or deal with the pain of working through this trauma from his childhood. So that was just a quick example. All right. So additionally, as mentioned prior, we don't want to use maladaptive ways of coping or managing our emotions, as this won't allow us to move forward or towards healing. All right. Okay, so I encourage you to be very honest with yourself about your triggers and how you react to them. Even if this approach feels harsh initially, it will help you learn to be more compassionate with yourself. Thinking honestly about your triggers is the only way to eventually heal from them. So we have to be honest with ourselves. All right. All right. So the road to healing from emotional triggers can be long at times, as mentioned before. So during the healing process, it's important to identify healthy ways to cope or manage our emotional triggers as we go along learning and or as we move forward with healing. Okay. So one of the most important steps to identifying triggers and managing them in healthy ways is to be self-aware, as mentioned before. Talk therapy is wonderful in aiding self-awareness. It allows for an opportunity to process situations and problems in order to get to know and understand yourselves better. So it's stigmatizing therapy is not productive. It's counterproductive to healing. All right. All right. So some simply recommended methods to effectively manage triggers. Some of them are exercising, resting, utilizing therapy or counseling. Just a quick note, therapy is long-term and counseling is more short-term. Also, you can use meditation or mindfulness. and also spending time with positive people. All right, so we want to limit time with negative friends, associates, and even family members, which is hard at times, but if at all possible, do it. All right, there is no a tool that I want to share with you is there is no guarantee that you can control or manage other people's behaviors, but you can always control and manage your own behaviors. All right, for example, someone is verbally disrespecting you. You kindly ask that person to not speak to you as such. Whether they listen or not, you cannot control that. So the advice here is to remove yourself from the situation if it is possible to do so safely. All right. All right, let me go back to 50. All right, so I just wanted to look at our inner child real quick. Exploring our inner child's contribution to emotional triggers. I mentioned the inner child earlier. I just wanted us to take a look at how our inner child affects or influences our behavior as adults. All right, so what does it mean to have an inner child? In popular psychology and analytical psychology, the term inner child is an individual's childlike aspect. It includes what a person learned as a child before puberty. The inner child is often conceived as a semi-independent sub-personality, subordinate to the waking conscious mind. All right. So a lot of times our inner child functions in our unconscious. Our inner child often manifests in our adult lives, quite often without us even realizing it. All right. So how to heal from emotional triggers. Healing your inner child focuses on uncovering and releasing the causes for the childlike aspects of our personality. So you can react to challenges in your adult life as an adult rather than as a kid or as a child. All right. The good news, healing your inner child can feel a lot like self-care, which is usually pleasant. All right. Question, does the inner child ever grow up? All right. So as long as we don't acknowledge and face our young feelings, our inner children don't have a chance to learn or grow. As we become more accepting, understanding, and loving towards ourselves as children, our inner child will begin to feel safe enough to come into our adult world and learn. All right, so how do you communicate with your inner child? These are some ways to do so. Basically, you could formulate a dialogue. You could write a letter to him or her, to yourself. Say nurturing things. I love you. I hear you. Thank you. I'm sorry. Look at photos of yourself as a child. You can think and write about what you loved doing when you were young. You can engage in meditation and creative visualization. All right. Example, picture this. All right. How to recognize and deal with emotional immaturity, right? It's a result of us leaving unhealed situations and then taking them into adulthood. Then we become emotionally immature. We don't address situations in an adult manner. We rather do so in a childlike manner. All right. So picture this. You're out on the town with your at a fancy new restaurant. Everything seems perfect. But when you try asking them about your future together, they keep switching the subject. Finally, you point it out, only to have them crack a joke at your expense, leaving you feeling all shades of frustration. While we have all had our moments of childishness, these antics can end up taking a toll on relationships because the other person is failing to take your feelings into account. I see this a whole lot. All right. All right. What exactly is it? Being emotionally immature. Someone emotionally immature will find it hard to effectively communicate or process their emotions and can often appear selfish or aloof. All right. Others might say in their own world. What are the key characteristic of someone who's emotionally immature? Here's a look at some signs of emotional immaturity that can show up in a relationship and steps you can take if you recognize them in your own relationship. All right. First one, they won't go deep. As we can see in the above scenario, an emotionally immature partner would delay tough conversations because they aren't able to make sense of their feelings or find them too overwhelming to deal with. They'll skim the surface of topics without revealing much and won't connect with you on a deeper level. Here are some diversion tactics they might use. Deflecting, big one, happens a whole lot. Laughing instead of opening up, telling you they have to fix something, the TV at that moment, saying that they're too stressed to talk, postponing your discussion for next week. All right, those are just some examples of deflecting. All right, so basically, emotionally immature persons thinks that everything is about them. This one's a biggie. People who are emotionally immature will always bring the me factor at inappropriate times. They may have a hard time understanding that the world doesn't revolve around them. If your partner doesn't pay attention to your concerns or interests, it's a clear sign they have some emotional growing to do. All right. All right. So emotionally immature persons become defensive quickly and easily. If you bring something up, they'll get overly defensive. For example, if you complain that they don't take out the garbage like they said they would, they'll respond with, "Why are you always on my case?" Or crack a condescending joke like, "Looks like someone's PMSing." Obviously, immature responses. All right. And in a relationship, I hope we are now seeing how not healing from emotional triggers can snowball and become more complex issues and problems if we don't take the time to heal. All right. All right, another one, they have commitment issues. Talking about the future can feel intimidating to someone who is emotionally immature. They'll avoid planning things together because they're afraid of limiting their freedom. They'll make up excuses for not meeting your parents or trying to schedule a vacation. Those are just some examples. It can be a sign they're commitment phobic. All right, this is another big one. They don't own their mistakes. All right, so in short, they aren't accountable. Instead of being thoughtful and admitting when they've messed up or when they're wrong, they'll place the blame on other people or circumstances beyond their control. This is where you may also find such persons resorting to lying, anything to avoid accountability. All right, so here are some things they might also say. My boss kept sending me emails and I didn't get around to it. Or Steve wanted to have another drink, so I couldn't make it home on time. Or my assistant forgot to remind me of today's lunch date. You know, any excuse. All right. So you may, in a relationship with an emotionally immature person, you may start to feel more alone than ever. All right. More than anything, you feel lonely and a sense, and an intimacy gap in your relationship. Bonding or connecting with your significant other becomes stunted because you feel a lack of support, understanding, and respect. You may begin to feel like there's also no way for you to articulate your needs and desire to discuss improvements. All right, how to handle it. If you find yourself nodding along and recognize the above signs in your partner, not all hope is lost. Emotional immaturity doesn't necessarily mean things aren't destined to work out. The key factor here is if the person is willing to make a change. That person has to be willing. All right. We can't change for anyone. They have to want to change. All right. So if in some ways you can approach this kind Okay. If so, below are some ways you can approach. Okay, I'm going to mention some ways you can approach this kind of behavior in the next slides. All right. Or you can address these kinds of behaviors. All right, let me make this bigger. All right. First thing you want to do is initiate a straightforward conversation. You want to bring it to their attention. One of the simplest yet potent things we can do is to talk to the other person and be open to feedback. You can let them know how their behavior is affecting you by using I statements and then proposing possible solutions. All right. This trains your brain to respond and not react out of anger or frustration. Here are some of the following you can try. Oh boy. Okay. Okay. Example. When we moved in together, we had plans to marry in a year. All right. You start with, I feel hurt and concerned that you won't discuss the topic with me anymore. Would you please help me figure out the reasons you're hesitating? So that's an example of how to use the I statement or I feel statement. Another example is when I am doing so many chores around the house every day, I feel overwhelmed and exhausted. Are there ways you can help me out with the weekly laundry and food preparation? All right. So I feel statements are great because basically your feelings are yours. No one can negate that. All right. And it doesn't come off as you attacking, and you see how a solution is presented at the end in each statement, which allows for the opportunity to have healthy communication and dialogue. All right.
Yeah. So Latoya, before we actually go into any further, I think we honestly, as some persons have said it, I think we may need a part two. But we actually have a lot of questions and statements already in the chat box that I think we probably should address and probably hold off and produce a part two to the conversation, because we know that there's a lot to this. We knew this would be a start. We understood that. Our goal was not to cure everybody in an hour. It was to open the conversation.
Right.
So there are a couple of questions, Latoya, and we can have a dialogue back and forth, as well as anyone who's in the chat as well. And you spoke about the inner child, Latoya.
Yes.
About the inner child. If we're gonna go ahead with the conversation, you can stop sharing your screen for us. And then that way everyone can stop seeing to me. All right. And so you mentioned about the inner child earlier, and a great question that was actually brought up was, is the inner child subjected to the voice of God? Is the inner child, does the inner child change when we receive the Holy Ghost? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's a very good question. Does the inner child change when we get the Holy Ghost? Okay. All right. I feel like I would say the inner child is still there because it's something that we need to work through. It's not going to the inner child doesn't go away as at the snap of a finger, right? It's not magic. It's not, we're human, and there's some things that happen naturally. The spirit world is a spirit world, right? The Holy Ghost is the Holy Ghost. But we still have flesh, and we still are humans, and we still have natural emotions. And the inner child, if I was going to describe the inner child from my own personal understanding, it's basically experiences that or trauma experience that we haven't dealt with or healed, or that we've suppressed. All right. So if it's suppressed, it's not going anywhere. It's going to sit there until we work on it. All right.
Thank you. I think one of the biggest things that we actually experience in the church realm is that many persons do actually have the notion that once you're filled with the Holy Ghost, everything that's really honestly erases. And we do need to address the fact that, you know, there's trauma in people's life, and thank God that they have now made the move to be able to depend on God to go through some pieces, and forgiveness is a big part of that, but it doesn't mean that it goes away. And I heard someone in the chat box mention, Latoya, about post-traumatic stress syndrome, postpartum depression, anxiety and depression. And I've heard it said in many times is that persons actually state that a child of God, can get depressed. A child of God should not have anxiety. A child of God, doesn't experience postpartum depression. A child of God doesn't go through post-traumatic stress syndrome. And I think that we do need to move past that. I believe that the Spirit of God is here to help us through circumstances. However, I do believe that we also need to acknowledge that there are mental issues in the church. There's mental health problems that persons go through in the church. And postpartum, that's a massive one. We have persons ladies who've had their babies and they're going through so much. And yet it's like, well, come on, cheer up. What's the matter with you? Have a baby now, and language comes out and the accent comes out and all those wonderful things. And we forget that it is a reality that they can be experiencing these pieces. And I know we mentioned about feeling free to speak to counselors and so forth, but I thought it very interesting that someone brought those pieces up, because once again, there is a stigma in the church. And so I don't know what you believe, Latoya, but I do believe that there are persons who are suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome. There are persons who are suffering from anxiety, persons who are suffering from depression, from postpartum, and they are afraid to even be open, ask prayer for it, whatever it may be, because of the stigma in the church. What are your thoughts on that?
As far as we have to change the culture, it's up to us to change the culture. Leaders such as myself, or persons such as myself, who have this knowledge, we have to start to change the culture by maybe even having group sessions, keep doing things such as this, so we can educate people, or educate ourselves, so we can change the culture. It's up to us to do it.
I agree. This actually was the question I had right below that. But what are your thoughts on having group sessions? I mean, luckily we have this platform now, but how open are persons in churches to having, a Saturday group session on anger, or, I agree with you. The culture has to change to be able to help persons deal with their emotions and become emotionally mature. So I do hope that we can continue group sessions like this to at least have the discussion pieces going. So other pieces that were coming out were you stressed about being very honest with yourself. And I know that's a struggle that some persons have. They're able to identify what's going on, but they're not truly honest with themselves. And you mentioned ways to cope: exercising, resting, therapy, counseling, and you differentiated the two. Thank you so much for doing that. Meditation, mindfulness, and limiting time with negative people, and being able to nurture yourself. And I agree. One of the biggest thing is you don't have to answer that phone. You don't have to speak to that person, because if it's going to throw you into if they're your trigger, Latoya, then don't accept your trigger. It's hard at times. But one of the questions that came out as well, Latoya, was, how do we help a person who is emotionally immature? And I know that you started going through those pieces, but my question to add to that, Latoya, was, if you yourself are emotionally immature, and if you are in this session right now trying to figure out, how do I deal with my own self? How do you even deal with a partner that's your trigger, but also emotionally immature?
How do you deal with yourself? I could address that. How do you deal with yourself? Again, being honest and then acknowledge it. If we can't acknowledge that it's there, we're not going to do anything to fix it. So that's when in relationships, your partner might become hopeless and want to leave the relationship because you're not with someone who is being honest with themselves and who's really acknowledging that they have an issue that they need to work on. So in situations like that, you the person that's having the struggle with themselves, you really have to be able to listen and take feedback, because a lot of times we can't, when we're in certain situations, we can't see ourselves. We can't, we're not aware. That's a good word. We're not aware of the behavior until somebody points it out, and we have to be willing to accept it before we can do any form of healing. You can't do any form of healing if you don't accept that you have the issue.
Thank you, and I do agree. I think we can't quote unquote fix others without dealing with ourselves. I mean, we can't take on the challenge of an immature partner or person when you yourself are emotionally unstable. It's just placing fuel on fire, as they would say. And so we have to take a step back and look at ourselves first. I'm just making sure that we haven't missed any comments in the chat here. I didn't make a note here. Ella Thompson mentioned that, post-traumatic stress syndrome is something that we have to address in this COVID era. And I really appreciate that, Elder Thompson, because that's something that, what are we thinking about that as ministers and leaders, that, how are the brethren coping? Not just financially, but how are they coping right now? And so we do have to, try and figure out how we're going to address with that. Another question that came up was, can you give some pointers on how to deal when your pastor becomes your trigger? Wow.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Because I naturally go to problem solving right away when I hear a question. So I'm thinking, hey, who's the pastor attached to? Does the pastor have a wife? Can you speak to the wife? Are you feel comfortable speaking to the wife? So you can have them speak to your pastor, so you can at some point meet in a group and have a conversation. In that situation, when the pastor is the issue, I think it's a good way to go about it is have a group session. So there's not a one-on-one, because you don't want to feel uncomfortable. You want to be comfortable enough to express how you're feeling. So a group session would be helpful, so you can feel supported. So a good way to go about that, I would say a group session is great. Also look for persons who are close to the pastor, who might be able to get the message across to he or she. So then dialogue can begin. And I would recommend in a group session. All right.
Okay. And I know that we have another counselor on the line. I'm going to ask her opinion as well. Evangelist Shirlene Johnson, I'm not sure. Can you chime in on that one? How can we approach pastors in a way that won't be seen as confrontational when they are your trigger? Any thoughts on that? I'm not sure if she's close by to respond, but just wanted some other thoughts on this as well, because this is a very touchy subject in regards to that.
Love to hear it.
I'm not sure if she's close by. Oh, she is. Okay.
I was listening to Sister Latoya doing pretty well on that one, and hope I never had to speak. So I do agree with her. It cannot be that you are speaking individually with the pastor, because the pastor may think it's an attack on him or her. It has to be a small group, trusted persons that you can speak with, and there's a discussion. Again, that group has to be very careful how the approach is made. Because although you think the pastor is the trigger, the pastor definitely doesn't think so. So it may seem like there's an attack. It may also seem like there is a group attack. So I would also look at, is there someone trained that maybe the pastor also is close to? that you could also involve in that conversation. Does the pastor have a mentor that you are also trusting that as a mentor mentee can also deal with this on a general basis? So those are some pointers for the person who has the trigger. That person has to also try to divert themselves from the trigger, dealing with them internally. And this is a huge topic. Latoya would know that you could take the entire night of dealing with this.
Yeah.
Because what caused the trigger for the individual, that person first has to do that self-awareness and work on themselves, even before touching the pastor. Because it could be what is in the person which reveals like a trigger. So there are some things that the individual can actually deal with to even subside or to minimize that level of trigger. So it goes both ways. I hope I was able to help.
No, thank you for bringing that last part in, Sister Johnson, was the fact that we have to remember that maybe we are the ones. Maybe the trigger is, you mentioned we identify something in ourselves, and as our vision skewed as to why we believe our pastor is a trigger. That's a heavy topic, and one deserving of its own session, as rightly said as well.
If I could say, Evangelist Boss, because if these things continue on both ends, and Latoya, they are not addressed, but you find that over a period of time, they mushroom and they get worse. And the person who receives the hurt, as well as the person giving the hurt, can also preach from a hurt space.
Yes.
And therefore, because both parties are hurt, you indirectly hurt others without even recognizing, because it's what is in you, it's what is in your spirit that comes out when you are preaching.
Hurt people hurt people.
Dealing with anything.
Yes, thank you. Yes, hurt people hurt people.
Correct.
So we definitely have some more to go, and I purposefully stopped Sister Latoya because I knew that some discussion was needed, and the benefit of the rest of her presentation wouldn't help us if we don't get some of these things in the way to have the discussion that's there. We do have a statement here that we need to look at church hurt as a session as well, but we also have a very interesting comment here in regards to COVID, Latoya. What your thoughts are, some pointers to help. Sometimes it's watching people around you suffer and pass away. I've had 7 co-workers locally pass away from COVID. We can't even celebrate their homegoing as normal. So that's something that we have to address as well too. What are your thoughts as well?
I've had this question posed to me in my work life, because I've also, my clients pass away and I've had to plan their funerals and then go to the funerals. So it's been rough, but I say we can come up with, especially because a lot of us, I've even experienced not being able to view by, because the person is COVID, the person that passed was COVID positive. So what they had to do was view a picture of the person before they were buried, which is even more traumatizing and hurtful, that you couldn't really see the person before they were buried. So I guess a way to problem solve is just one way that I could put out there, is to try to come up with creative ways to celebrate that person. As far as maybe like a memorial service where persons can get together and talk about that person's life and celebrate their lives. If they can't gather together because of COVID-19, or they don't have the space to gather together, they can do so over a platform such as this one, so they can communicate and have a sense of community and support. just just one way of still having support and getting out emotion and talking and having a community of persons to reach out to. So I would say utilize similar platforms as such as these and just use it to celebrate the person's memory and what their legacy is and what they left behind. All right, that's just one way that I would put out there.
I think in addition to that, Sister Latoya, one of the things is that, we sometimes depend on others to initiate that session. If you feel that you are in that particular position and you need that support, reach out. Maybe there's always someone else who may feel the way that you feel, and having that conversation is important. Maybe you're the one who will initiate that online session of just expressing how you feel at that point in time and addressing it. So don't forget, it can start with you too. It doesn't have to be someone else that organizes it at the same time.
Agreed.
Okay. Well, I think at this point, based on the fact that we do have so many different pointers here, and it's almost 9 o'clock, I just wanted to reiterate some points that Sister Latoya made. She told us that there are 5 strategies that we need to take a look at. It is to be self-aware. It is to track the origin of our emotions, reprogram our negative beliefs, and begin to act as if, put things in motion as if they were our reality. And of course, work with a therapist or a coach. And so we are encouraging the brethren who are on the line, if you know someone, if you yourself are going through anything, if there's anything that's unresolved, please feel free to reach out to us. We can see who we can connect you with, but also note that we do recommend you looking for counselors or pastors that have counseling attached to their position, or online. There are online platforms of Christian counselors that you can find as well. And I think we also need to get over a piece of it as well in terms of the cost. I've actually heard many Christians say that they won't pay for it, but I will say this to you: if you value your emotional health, you may have to pay for that, and that's a part of the process when it comes to healing. Think about your worth, and if paying a counselor or a therapist is something that you may even need assistance with, how do we find assistance for you? There's so many things to discuss in this, but we want to encourage you to know that there are persons there to help. And we just want to pray and ask God to continue for those who are emotionally hurt and those who are emotionally scarred. We talk about wounds. We're asking God to really truly just give persons the ability just to go through until they can connect with that right person to help navigate them through. And I want to reiterate something. Sister Latoya mentioned, you're the one who heals yourself. The person who is going to be there, they're just helping you navigate. They are not your answer. They're just helping you to navigate to help you get to the answer. So person was no good. You have to help yourself along in that process. Sister Latoya, I know we haven't officially closed off because we obviously need a part 2 and probably some other sessions as well. But what will be your closing words of encouragement before we go?
All right. My closing words to hit on. All right. One thing that I would encourage you with, or would leave you with, try to be, understanding with each other, compassionate with each other, because as Sister Charlene mentioned earlier, the hurt can transfer. And a lot of times it's not deliberate. A lot of times a person's behavior towards you has little or nothing to do with you, and more so with the turmoil that's going on inside of them. So if we can not take certain behaviors or attitudes towards us personally, a lot of the times that will be, it makes it easier for us to be understanding and to forgive. But if we take on it as a personal attack, a lot of the times it becomes harder. All right. So just being understanding. That's what has helped me to navigate a lot of relationships, is being aware that persons might always be working through pain or whatever the situation might be when they come across you, and their behavior a lot of times doesn't necessarily have to do with you. So I think it's, and then in that case, you want to try to have a open dialogue if you can, and if it's safe to do so. You want to try to have communicate and try to have an open dialogue to try to understand each other better. And always remember that try always to listen to understand. I can't mention that enough, because a lot of times we get persons who are listening and they're already formulating a response in their mind, or they've already have one that they're sitting on to respond with. So they're not even listening to the next person. So you won't get to understand each other, and you won't get to a resolve, and it wouldn't be considered healthy, a healthy way of communicating. All right. So that's what I would leave you with.
Thank you, Sister Latoya. I do appreciate that as well. And just as we go, we do have church family on the line tonight. I must ask you just to bow your heads wherever we are. Heavenly Father, God, we thank you for bringing us together tonight. God, we understand that this is the beginning of something. And God, we know there's a lot of emotional pain that is packed out on the inside of us. And God, you desire all of us. And these things do distract us from being wholly committed to you, as well as understanding and wholly committed to ourselves. And so, God, as we go down this journey to understand our emotions and to heal, praise God, through this process, we're asking for your help. We're asking for your guidance. We're asking for patience. We're asking for understanding. And we hope that you can bring this group together again as we continue to talk about our emotional triggers, talking about our emotional instabilities, to become not just spiritually mature, but to become emotionally mature and to have effective impact on others. God, we thank you for this gathering tonight. And we're asking that as we go separately, that we do walk away with something tonight, knowing that amidst everything, that you still are the giver of life, even emotionally, that you can help us through our emotions, through the need for forgiveness, the need for healing. But Lord, you said faith without works is dead. And so we've got to do our part as well. We thank you for Sister Latoya tonight. God, we pray you continue to bless her. Use her for your kingdom, God. Obviously, there is a need in your kingdom. Use her for your kingdom, God. Continue to enlighten her. And we pray that you'll continue to bless this medium and bless this process that we're going through, in Jesus' name.
Amen.
Everyone, thank you so much for joining tonight. We know that it's not the complete session. We realized that we didn't know if it would go through all the way, to be honest with you. And it was evident. You've proven to us that we do need to have more sessions. We need to talk about, have discussions. And the fact that I saw some persons agree when Sister Latoya mentioned it immediately, group sessions, we will do our best to continue to see how we can help to facilitate that. But also we're going to hope that we can move this into the local churches as well, as best as we can when we can. So God bless you. Thank you for joining us tonight. You can feel free to reach out to myself, Sister Latoya. I'm not sure how many persons on here got your information, but I'm going to offer her to you as well, in case you just want someone to just connect with or to point you in the right direction as well. So thank you all so much, Latoya. Thank you so much. I know it takes a lot of work and I cut you short, but thank you so much for your patience and answering the questions, and for all those as well for joining us. May God bless you, and thank you for tonight. Bye-bye.
Have a good night.
Good night.